Everyone in the auto shop exploded in laughter. When 13-year-old Sierra Maddox, the black daughter of a poor mechanic, stepped quietly among the rows of gleaming suits, Mr. Callister, the powerful boss in his tailored suit, dared her to fix an engine that even his top team of engineers at the engineers had thrown their hands up at. The cameras were rolling. Everyone expected her to fail. But the moment Sierra lifted the hood, her gaze sharpened, and the first words out of her mouth left every adult in the room frozen. No one could have been prepared for the shocking truth she was about to reveal that day. It was just before dawn in the southern outskirts of the city. The old buildings cast long shadows over streets marred with oil stains and peeling paint. The first weak rays of sunlight pierced the gray mist, glinting off the dusty windows of the run-down apartment block where Sierra and her mother lived. In the tiny room, barely large enough for 2 narrow beds and a battered kitchen table, Sierra woke before the clock struck 6. She stretched and slipped a faded hoodie over her head. Her sneakers, scuffed at the heels, still bore traces of grease from the day before. Her mother, Mrs. Maddox, sat by the window, eyes heavy with worry as she watched her daughter move, pity mingling with a fragile hope she'd never dared voice aloud. Outside, the distant blast of a truck horn echoed down the main road, punctuated by the rattling clang of overturned trash bins. Sierra's apartment was on the ground floor, right off the shared walkway, where each morning a group of white neighbors gathered to sip their coffee and exchange hushed comments. Sierra barely stepped outside before she heard the familiar whispers. "There goes that Maddox kid, dressed like a boy, roaming around that filthy garage again." I don't know why her mother lets her hang out in those nasty places. Just look at that hair. Sierra held her head high and said nothing. Her eyes burned with resolve, though a familiar sting of pain tugged at her heart. She'd grown used to the pitying glances and the subtle head shakes that meant her way. "You don't belong here." She walked across the parking lot, beneath walls splashed with faded graffiti, her feet splashing through murky puddles left by last night's rain. In this neighborhood, everyone knew. Her father, Mr. Maddox, was one of the few black mechanics who'd hung on for 20 years, working twice as hard for half the pay simply because of the color of his skin. Sierra passed the corner grocery store, where the owner often slipped her day-old rolls. Some neighbors offered polite nods, others averted their eyes, pretending not to notice her. Though she'd lived here her whole life, Sierra always felt an invisible line between herself and the world around her, unspoken but unmistakable in the sideways glances, the whispered comments, and the doors that stayed shut without explanation. Why did her skin color make people see her differently? Why did she have to work twice as hard just to earn the same respect? Those questions smoldered in her mind each morning, urging her steps to quicken as she made her way toward her father's garage. The shop's gate stood at the end of a narrow alley. The peeling sign, "Maddox's Auto Repairs," peeked out from under the shade of 2 ancient maples. Every time Sierra crossed that threshold, she felt the garage was more than just her father's workplace. It was the family's fortress, a place he'd built with sweat and tears over 2 decades, weathering countless sneers, stolen contracts, and customers who tried to lowball him simply because he was black. This morning, the shop was busier than usual. The hum of conversation, the roar of running engines, and the sight of polished suits drifting past the dusty windows told her today would be no ordinary day. Still, Sierra stepped forward, eyes fixed on her father as he wiped grease from his hands at the tool bench. As long as those lights were on, she knew she had a reason to keep fighting. She could still hear the whispers from outside, but Sierra didn't look back. Her steps were light, but unhesitating, leaving behind a world of prejudice and carrying with her her mother's quiet hope and her father's unbreakable strength as she entered the small auto shop's dim morning glow. The moment Sierra's foot left the threshold, the air inside Maddox's auto repairs grew thick, a familiar blend of engine oil, sweat, and metal dust. But today, it was laced with tension, curiosity, and a strange weariness. The usual grease-stained work coveralls now mingled with polished suits and neatly knotted ties, a surreal sight for this humble blue-collar garage. A group of outsiders from Wilcor Motors, the region's largest, most powerful automaker, had clustered around a workbench at the shop center, their voices heavy with technical jargon and an unspoken warning that outsiders don't belong here. Nearby, local managers hovered over tablet screens, their eyes shifting between data and the doorway, as if waiting for the slightest mistake to report back up the chain. Sierra paused, not out of hesitation, but because the atmosphere felt almost electric. At the shop entrance, the guard, broad-shouldered, punch, protruding, forever asserting his authority, spotted her and knitted his brow in annoyance. "Kids aren't welcome in here today," he said, his emphasis on the last words like a punch to her chest, "especially ones like you." He spoke loudly enough that everyone in the shop could hear, as if to declare, "This is an adult space, and you don't fit." Her father, bent over a tool bench, looked up at the sound, poised to move to her side, but the guard's glare held him back. For a heartbeat, his features tightened, then settled back into their usual calm. In a far corner, two young mechanics, one Latino, one white, exchanged mocking grins and burst out, "Think Mr. Maddox's daughter's going to get to tinker with the car today, then post it on TikTok for fame, like those dudes downtown? Or maybe she'll live stream for us. Could be the next hot mechanic girl star." Their derisive laughter cut through Sierra colder than the early morning breeze. She lowered her head, fingers clutching her backpack straps, jaw clenched, but outwardly remained composed. For just a moment her eyes flashed, still before softening again, recalling her father's late-night counsel. "Let them think you don't know a thing, sweetheart. Silence is your weapon when they look down on you, but never let anyone decide what you're capable of just because of who you are, because of your skin." An older Wilcor engineer, with graying hair and thick glasses, stood beside the prototype on its hoist, casting Sierra a glance that mixed pity with cool detachment, the look of someone accustomed to the industry's unspoken rules. He said nothing, returning to the stack of documents in his hand, as if her presence were but a mote of dust in today's big event. Over by the center engine, Mr. Callister's assistant scrolled notes on a clipboard, eyes flicking to Sierra as though she were an unscheduled anomaly. The assembled engineers and managers hushed their side chatter and turned toward the covered engine on its stand, the focal point of what felt like a ritual sacrifice. With each step Sierra took, she sensed every gaze tracking, dissecting her every move. Those looks carried more than curiosity. They bore the deep-seated prejudice of people convinced that a black mechanic's daughter, from the wrong side of town, could never step out from her father's shadow. Today, the scent inside Maddox's garage was no longer just oil and clanging metal. It was an invisible wall of bias, unspoken power, and closed minds. Yet Sierra inhaled deeply. She didn't know where this day would take her, but she did know this. Every step, every cold stare would fuel her resolve. And ahead, in the depths of the shop, her father's silhouette stood unwavering and silent, the only anchor in a sea of hostility. Sierra had barely edged in beside the tool bench, her mind still echoing with the mocking laughter and scrutinizing stares of the men in the shop, when the roar of an engine down the alley hushed everything. Everyone recognized it as the signal for something big. The heavy garage door rumbled open, and a glossy black SUV rolled in, its polished surface reflecting the slate-gray dawn and standing in stark contrast to the battered paint-chipped cars inside. The suited men straightened their ties at once, and the local managers pressed themselves against the walls, as though a single glance from this newcomer could seal their fate today. Conversation snapped off mid-sentence. Even the familiar hum of the shop's radio was abruptly silenced. The SUV door swung open. Out stepped Mr. Callister, the regional operations director for Wilcor Motors, whispered about as a miracle worker whenever crisis struck, flanked by his impeccably dressed aides. He was tall, salt-and-pepper hair slicked back, wearing a dark blue custom suit and a gleaming silver watch at his wrist. His face betrayed little emotion, beyond a half-smile that felt icy, eyes glinting behind designer shades as he surveyed the garage like an inspector evaluating an oddity rather than human beings. Sierra stood close by, every heartbeat echoing in her ears, knuckles whitening around the edge of the bench. When Callister's gaze passed over her, it lingered only for a split second, as if a black girl in a mechanic's shop weren't worth more than a glance. Then, without warning, he paused in front of her father, making Mr. Maddox look smaller than he'd ever seen himself under this towering figure. Callister lowered his voice, part taunt, part insinuation, but loud enough for all to hear. "Mr. Maddox, today your daughter is here to clean the shop, or to prove she's a mechanical genius." The final words cut through the air like a blade, dripping with sarcasm. A few Wilcor engineers exchanged smirks. The young manager at his side looked positively gleeful, his mocking eyes flicking to Sierra before seeking approval from his boss. To them, a black girl in this technical arena could only be a cosmic joke, or a brazen insult to their standards. The shop air felt frozen. Some young mechanics polishing cars stilled their rag wiping. Glances darted between father and daughter, curiosity tinged with weariness. Shame and anger flickered across Mr. Maddox's face, but he answered Callister with a tight-lipped smile, his eyes flicking to Sierra with both worry and pride. Sierra remained motionless, feeling every look pierce her. Ridicule mingled with pity and a simmering hostility. No one spoke up. No one dared confront the powerful man. An invisible circle, the circle of bias and exclusion, seemed to tighten around the Maddoxes. There was no opening for protest, only the silent bowing of heads, waiting for this special test to begin, an ordeal rigged from the start. In that stifling atmosphere, Sierra understood. Today's challenge wasn't just about machinery. It was a silent battle against entrenched power and unwritten rules that had never admitted her or her father as a true part of this world. No sooner had that suffocating silence settled than two Wilcor technicians rolled a large dolly into the middle of the shop. On it sat a massive engine shrouded in a black tarp, a bright red label plastered to its side reading, "Top Secret. Do not touch." Wilcor's lead, Engineers immediately swarmed around it, faces alight with equal parts excitement and tension. Some snapped open laptops and hooked up diagnostic gear, watching lines of error codes flood the screens. Keystrokes and whispered analyses blended into an invisible pressure that filled the cramped garage. Mr. Callister stood at the edge of the group, arms folded, exuding the confidence of an arrogant director awaiting the final act. Each time a young engineer shook his head in defeat, Callister's lips curled into a knowing half-smile as he surveyed the crowd. Yet no one solved the impossible puzzle. Even the award-winning team lead could do nothing but sigh, wipe his brow, and step back in awkward frustration. Whispers rippled through the onlookers that Wilcor's trap must be beyond anyone's skill. Then, after a dramatic pause, Callister turned toward the Maddoxes and offered a smile, both mocking and cold. "Gentlemen," he called out, so every ear would catch it, "it seems my seasoned experts are stumped. Or shall we see what Mr. Maddox's daughter's magic touch can do?" A few engineers stifled laughs, and some mechanics shook their heads as if pitying the show about to begin. Voices hissed. "Let's see how hard she'll fall. Free comedy hour, anyone?" Mr. Maddox moved as if to defend his daughter, anger flashing in his eyes. But Sierra gently pressed his arm and shook her head, her gaze fixed on Callister. In her eyes blazed a determination, no pity, no protection, only the resolve of someone hardened by storms of prejudice. Callister folded his arms and tilted his head, triumphant, as though he'd merely scripted the spectacle to liven the crowd. Yet behind that grin lay a cruel challenge, a lesson for anyone daring to step into their world uninvited. Sierra took a steady step toward the engine, each footfall echoing lonely amid the jeers. She knew this was more than a mechanical test. It was a confrontation with dozens of eyes waiting for her to falter so they could say, "See, no matter what you try, you can't escape your place." In this makeshift theater of bias and power, Maddox's auto repairs felt like a grand stage for a predetermined tragedy, until only her father's quiet gaze from behind broke through the hostility, silently assuring her that even if the world turned its back, hope lived on in her refusal to give up. The mocking laughter still echoed, but Sierra kept moving forward, each step feeling endlessly stretched between two walls of scrutinizing eyes, half filled with contempt, half with eager anticipation of a black girl's failure. The space seemed to shrink around the prototype engine draped in tarp, every sound muted by the weight of tension pressing in. Sierra paused and laid her slender hand on the cold metal. The chill burned up her palm to her shoulder. Yet deep in her mind, memories surged. She could still picture herself crouched beneath a car with her father on pouring rain days, oil running down her wrists, his voice tired, yet full of love. "You know, not every engine will roar to life with just the press of a button. It's the same for us black folks in this city. Sometimes you've got to listen to the tiniest sounds, study every detail, and never let yourself fear what other people see." Silence reigned in the shop until a young engineer's voice cut through it, equal parts taunt and malice. "Touch it, and it'll break for sure, kid." Another piped up with a half-smirk. "Or maybe it'll be another user error. Who knows? This could go viral on TikTok." To some, those words would feel like a mortal blow, but Sierra was hardened by a lifetime of rejection and ridicule at school, on the street, even from customer who walked out of her father's garage because he was black. All that had forged in her a resilience that no cruelty could easily shatter. She began her inspection. First, the outer casing. Sierra glided her fingertips along the seams, feeling the faintest vibration under the metal, as if sensing the machine's mood. Then she leaned in close, listening to the steady clicks within, each pulse like a familiar melody only she could decipher. Her eyes darted to the sensors, noting the position of an out-of-place wire, then flicked to the tablet displaying endless lines of error codes. Unhurried, unflustered, she methodically checked every bolt and joint, matching each detail to nights spent wide awake with her father, coaxing the trickiest cars back to life. At first, the onlookers continued to sneer, shaking their heads in derision, but gradually the smirks fell away. No one expected such calm precision from a girl. Her quiet diligence created a pressure of its own, drawing the jeering crowd into watching her every move. The Wilcor engineers, accustomed to outsiders failing, now whispered among themselves, their eyes shifting from scorn to doubt, then to uneasy vigilance. Mr. Callister stood off to the side, his brow furrowing, arms crossed, studying Sierra's expressions. He said nothing, but in his narrowed eyes flickered surprise, mingled with a vague frustration, as if his absolute authority was being challenged by something beyond his control. Sierra felt the weight of all those expectations bearing down on her, the perfect fall they craved to cement the garage's unspoken boundaries. Yet instead of fear, that gaze of theirs fueled her resolve, a determination not to crack, even when the world seemed eager to see her break. And in that moment, an imperceptible shift began. From contempt to curiosity, from mocking to genuine observation, from anticipation of failure to anxious fascination at the unexpected unfolding before them. The tension in the shop snapped taut. Every pair of eyes, every held breath fixed on Sierra as she straightened up, her gaze blazing with resolve amid the cold stares of those in power. She drew a deep breath and spoke, her voice ringing out clear and steady in the silent garage. "This engine isn't broken. It's programmed to fake faults, to mislead anyone who works on it." In that instant, sound itself seemed to freeze. The crowd went rigid, unbelieving. The Wilcor engineers, untouchable authorities in their field, were suddenly spectators, captivated by the impossible. A young engineer frowned, another scowled, while the mechanics just whispered to each other, stunned. Callister strode forward, eyes sharp as knives, lips pressed into a thin, frosty line. "What did you just say? On what basis do you accuse my entire engineering team? You're implying these people who live and breathe this work are at fault." His final words weren't a joke, but a serious threat. He closed in, his towering frame blocking the light over Sierra. Beneath his calm exterior burned fury and disbelief. He wouldn't accept that a black girl would dare challenge his reputation in his own domain. But Sierra didn't flinch. She moved to the diagnostic bench and deftly swiped through screens on the tablet, her fingers dancing across the display in a practiced rhythm that left everyone agape. She dove deeper into menus the other engineers stumbled over. Her lips tightened, eyes locked on the streams of data, each steady motion revealing someone who not only understood machinery, but also the prejudiced gazes trying to hold her back. A single beep rang out. Sierra pointed at the screen. "Look here. This isn't a mechanical error. It's a looping command sequence designed to hide the real data. If we go further... She tapped a few more commands, and the screen flashed red with a message larger than any other. Internal sabotage detected. Error source, Wilcor headquarters. A ripple of astonishment swept the shop. Eyes accustomed to victory widened in shock. Engineers, managers, mechanics, all levels of the garage couldn't believe what they saw. Whispers surged. No way. Wilcor messed up. How did this kid even find that? Callister took a step back, his complexion draining. No more confidence, no more authority, only unmistakable horror. He scanned the room for allies, but all he saw were doubtful, unsettled expressions and a silent spark of admiration for Sierra. The prejudice that black kids don't know anything shattered right before their eyes by a few calm taps from a girl once deemed an embarrassment. It wasn't just the engine laid bare. It was the exposed arrogance, the unchecked power, the invisible barriers that had shackled this shop for years, all crumbling like sudden summer rain on concrete. In Sierra's father's eyes flickered pride and disbelief together, as if he'd never dared dream that his daughter could upend a whole world built by those who thought themselves its center. The flash of red text on the screen hadn't even faded away before a wave of commotion and confusion rippled through Maddox's auto repairs. The tense hush gave way to frantic whispers and doubtful glances. Nobody was laughing anymore, and no one dared crack jokes. The Wilcor engineers once, so proud of their expertise and status, now exchanged furtive looks. No longer colleagues, but potential conspirators in a shocking cover-up. Some engineers blushed and stared at the floor, while others rifled through their own diagnostic logs, desperate to find an excuse for their failure, only to reveal more clearly their shame and the cracks in their faith in the very company they served. At last, an older engineer with streaks of silver in his hair, clutching a thick binder, mustered the courage to speak. His voice was low but precise, heavy with regret. Truth is, I've seen those error codes repeat before. I asked the test team once, but I just assumed it was old software or a system glitch. I didn't report it because I was afraid of being labeled a troublemaker, of losing my job. No sooner had he finished than a younger colleague timidly nodded in agreement. Even a petite, sorrow-faced woman whispered, I got chewed out by my boss when I asked about those looping errors. I'm sorry, Mr. Maddox. The shop fell into a weighted silence. Those quiet confessions cut deep into the confident, arrogant shell Wilcor had maintained for years. Prejudice, fear, and blind obedience had muffled conscience, turning passionate professionals into passive bystanders, terrified of power, of speaking up, of standing out. From his spot of authority, Callister suddenly found himself backed into a corner. His face drained of color, lips pressed into a cold, gray line. He tried to reclaim his last shred of command in a sharp bark that reverberated through the now frozen air. "Shut it! This is my shop, not a playground for some colored kid. Everyone back to work, or get out of my sight." But this time, Callister's booming threat fell flat. Several engineers turned away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others shook their heads, sighing. The fear that once ruled them had shifted into deep disappointment. Disappointment in their leader, in their organization, and in themselves. Sierra stood still, quietly, taking in every movement, every eye, every ounce of regret filling the room. She knew that what she'd just exposed wasn't merely a technological hoax, but a rotten power structure built on silence, fear, and cover-ups. Her father, standing behind her, gripped her hand so tightly his knuckles went white. In his eyes lay anguish for his daughter and for all the struggles they had endured under prejudice and suppression, but also a pride beyond words. Today, in front of all these witnesses, Sierra had achieved what generations before her thought impossible. Now the garage felt like a patchwork of light and shadow, the trembling of those beginning to face the truth, and the lingering anger of those still clinging to old authority. The line between justice and complicity had never felt so thin, pushing everyone to the brink of an irreversible change. The air in the shop was still heavy with guilt and confusion when suddenly the roll-up door slammed open, drawing every eye to the front. Firm footsteps echoed across the concrete as 3 people in black suits entered, led by a female agent in a sharp navy pantsuit, her Federal Transportation Safety Commission badge gleaming on her lapel. The entire garage seemed to hold its breath. Before anyone could react, the agent strode straight to the center, her gaze steely as she spoke in a clear, icy tone of authority. "We received an anonymous tip that this prototype engine's data was tampered with. Show me the device." At her words, everyone from the Wilcor engineers to the local managers and mechanics turned at once to look at Sierra, the small black girl standing by the engine, sweat beading on her brow but her eyes still blazing. Just minutes ago, she'd been marginalized. But now she'd become the unexpected focal point of this unfolding storm. Callister instantly recovered his composure and stepped forward, voice polite, but laced with irritation and unease. "Excuse me, but this is an internal Wilcor technical issue. There's no need to—" The agent cut him off without so much as a glance his way. "Secure the scene, collect all data. No one leaves until this investigation is complete." Her 2 backup agents immediately moved to block the exits, motioning everyone to place their phones and tablets on the nearest table. The tension ratcheted upward. The Wilcor engineers, truly unsettled now, rifled nervously through messages and logs. The local workers eyed each other anxiously. Some drifted away from the managers, as if afraid of being implicated. Callister's jaw clenched. He glared at Sierra as if she alone were responsible for bringing Wilcor's entire operation to a standstill. He stepped close, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You've just put everyone here in deep trouble. Who do you think you are?" Sierra said nothing. She met his gaze calmly, her eyes conveying that in this moment the truth mattered more than any threat. Behind her, Mr. Maddox watched with worry and, for the first time, a spark of pride. He knew the circle of prejudice in this place had just been shattered by a small but undeniable force. The agent wasted no time, pointing directly at Sierra. "Who discovered this irregularity?" Silence fell once more as all eyes returned to her. Sierra inhaled slowly and nodded. In that instant, she was no longer an outsider. She was a key witness, the linchpin in a major investigation where once untouchable powers now had nowhere left to hide. In a corner, a Wilcor engineer whispered, "That's it. Never thought everything could collapse because of a black kid." But beneath that shock, fear, and helplessness, a new undercurrent had begun to glow: respect. Once again, the truth spoken by the weakest among them had the power to overturn the balance of power and force, even those sitting atop the throne to look inward. After that frozen moment in the shop, with so many eyes fixed on her, Sierra felt her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Though her palm was slick with sweat, she remained composed. The federal agent, her gaze both steely and compassionate, looked Sierra squarely in the eye and asked again without hesitation, "Who discovered this irregularity?" Sierra hesitated, not out of fear, but because she knew that once she answered, nothing would ever be the same. Then the image of her father standing silently behind her, years of enduring cruelty, rose within her like a quiet well of strength. She lifted her chin and replied firmly, "Me." Her answer rang out in the holding silence of the garage, tearing down the wall of silence built for the powerless. The agent studied Sierra for a long moment, surprise flickering across her face before giving way to genuine admiration. She nodded, then turned to the other agents and the Will Corps engineers. If not for this young woman, hundreds, if not thousands, could have been in danger. If this engine went into mass production, it would be a disaster, not just for Will Corps, but for the entire community. Those words echoed off the peeling walls, and everyone who had mocked or dismissed Sierra suddenly bowed their heads in silence. In some of the Will Corps engineers' eyes, shame mingled with an unspoken respect. They, once confident that their expertise guaranteed safety, now faced the truth that intelligence, courage, and intuition know no age, gender, or skin color. Mr. Maddox, standing behind her, felt tears well in his eyes. For the first time, he realized how every slight and whispered rumor, the lost contracts, the community's judgment, had laid the groundwork for this moment, where his daughter stood recognized for her own talent and determination. But in the shadowed ranks of those in power, Callister and the Will Corps managers no longer looked composed. Behind their polite nods and thin smiles lurked real anxiety. What if she uncovers more? What if there are more violations? If things spiral further out of control, how long will our positions, bonuses, and authority hold? Callister narrowed his eyes and took a cautious step back, his expression dark. He knew today had gone far beyond anything he'd anticipated. A small black girl, once ridiculed and sidelined, had become the force shaking the very pillars of power. In a corner of the shop, a young engineer whispered, barely audible, "We should have listened from the start." In the pale dawn light, Sierra didn't know what lay ahead, but she understood that this moment of recognition was not only a foundation for her own confidence, it was the beginning of a much larger battle, one that those in power would not relinquish or concede lightly. The moment Sierra was acknowledged felt like a hidden crack forming in the wall of prejudice. Before, the murmurs of admiration had even settled. Callister, his face clouded with anxiety and wounded pride, suddenly whipped out Sierra's school records and resume from his briefcase, the ultimate weapons he intended to use to defend his own reputation and that of Will Corps. He marched straight in front of the federal agents and the assembled engineers, his tone dripping with arrogance as it echoed through the shop. "A black kid with no credentials, no standing. Now you're telling me she can overthrow Will Corps Motors on gut instinct alone? Who's going to be held accountable if she's wrong? How many people are out there relying on us? On professionals with real degrees and real experience?" His words rang out across the fractured air, sending ripples of unease through the crowd. A few younger engineers glanced at Sierra, their expressions flickering between curiosity, doubt, and guilt as they remembered how they'd once sneered at her. A handful of Will Corps managers whispered among themselves, knuckles white, as if grasping at the fear that their power might slip away. The tension became suffocating. The divide was stark. On one side, the old world of paperwork, titles, and rigid systems. On the other, the fragile spark of hope ignited by a small black girl whom everyone had underestimated. Just then, the shop's side door flew open, and decisive footsteps cut through the stillness. A silver-haired man, in a tailored suit, strode in with an air of authority, but his eyes held unmistakable determination. It was Director Hale of the U.S. Department of Transportation, bringing a fresh breeze into the stifling space of prejudice. Ignoring the records Callister still brandished, Director Hale turned directly to Sierra. His voice was deep and steady, his gaze locked on her as if no one else was in the room. "Do you dare try cracking a security code that my hundreds of engineers have failed to solve for 2 years?" Nobody answered. Time itself seemed to pause. All eyes, whether skeptics or supporters, fixed on Sierra, the sole hope for truth, for fairness, for what real merit and human worth meant. Sierra took a steady breath and glanced at her father. Mr. Maddox pressed against a corner, his face a mix of worry and pride. The laughter and whispers of her detractors melted away. She felt her heart pounding stronger than ever. This wasn't about proving herself to doubters anymore. It was about answering every people of color cant ever spoken, to show herself, her parents, and all the children whose dreams were dismissed, that any boundary drawn by others can be erased. She lifted her chin and nodded firmly at Director Hale, with no hint of hesitation. Every eye turned back to her, and a new battle began. One not just against a cold, unfeeling machine, but against a deeply entrenched system of prejudice that would no longer go unchallenged. The air inside Maddox's auto repairs felt thick and heavy as everyone held their breath, watching Sierra's every move. Director Hale carefully withdrew a sealed envelope from his briefcase, the front stamped in bold red. "Confidential, national security level." He set it before Sierra with a solemn nod, his expression betraying the weight of the moment. Sierra reached out and picked up the envelope, her fingertips trembling, not from fear, but from the awareness that every eye in the room was pinned on her, brimming with trust, doubt, suspicion, and hope all at once. Outside, the burly security guard stood with arms crossed, face cold as ice. The line of Will Corps engineers was utterly silent, tension etched so deep that no one dared to even exhale forcefully. Federal agents fanned out around the room, eyes sharp and hands hovering near holsters. Everybody braced for an unprecedented turn of events. Sierra tore open the envelope and pulled out a stack of pages dense with hexadecimal codes and symbols, the same encrypted sequence that had baffled military servers for 2 years. She laid them on the workbench, then pulled out her battered phone and opened the custom app she'd programmed herself, born of endless, sleepless nights and quiet kitchen table coding sessions under a single flickering lamp. The garage fell silent, but for the soft taps on her touchscreen. Sierra's lips pressed together, brow furrowed in concentration as she scanned each string of numbers, tuned in to the subtle patterns that only someone who listens to machines with her heart could detect. Her small hands, stained with engine grease, moved with precision and confidence, the mark of someone accustomed to working under pressure, beneath mocking stares, and through relentless prejudice. At the edge of the room, Callister couldn't resist a vicious whisper to the manager beside him, loud enough for several people to catch. "What a joke! Some poor, colored kid cracking what our military servers couldn't. It's just a fluke." Let her embarrass herself for all the world to see. Murmurs rippled again, but this time, no one dared laugh. The scene on the bench held a strange gravity. Sierra, methodically entering code into her app, was doing something no one expected. A Wilcor engineer, famed for his credentials, swallowed hard, a mix of bewilderment and, just beneath the surface, admiration etching his features. Under that intense pressure, Sierra closed her eyes for a single breath, recalling her father's words from childhood. Sometimes the most important rules aren't the ones others set. They're the ones your own instincts tell you. Don't fear trying again. Don't fear making mistakes. And never believe you're less worthy just because of your skin color. In that instant, Sierra spotted the anomaly in the code. The repeating sequence that modern algorithms mistook for error check routines was actually a phantom loop, an illusion crafted to trap machine logic and lead analysts down a dead end. Trusting her intuition, Sierra stripped out all the redundant loops and reordered the remaining segments. Suddenly, the once insurmountable string of characters fell away into a coherent logical sequence, revealing the engine's core decryption key. As the room processed her revelation, Sierra looked up and handed the decoded sheet to Director Hale. No boastful flourish, just the calm, steady gaze of someone who'd poured every ounce of courage and intellect into this life-or-death challenge. Behind her, Mr. Maddox gripped the table edge, eyes shining with pride. In front of her, the entire garage seemed to hold a collective breath, witness to the moment when a small black girl forced a room full of powerful people to fall silent and pay attention. When Sierra handed the decryption sheet to Director Hale, the entire room seemed to freeze. He unfolded the paper and scanned the rows of numbers and symbols. His brow furrowed, then suddenly relaxed as he reached the final lines. His voice, thick with emotion, cut through the tension that had been filled with doubt and challenge. This is it. This is the source key we've been searching for these past 2 years. Those words shattered the silence like thunder, releasing the unbearable pressure in an instant. The garage erupted. Federal agents swarmed to verify every step, while even the Wilcor engineers who'd sneered before broke into spontaneous applause. They looked at each other and then at Sierra in disbelief that a small black girl could breach the professional, impenetrable wall they'd built over 2 years. The hulking security guards stood aghast, their expressions shifting from skepticism to wonder and respect. Even the staunchest Wilcor managers could no longer deny reality. The truth had been rewritten by an outsider through talent and unwavering will. Director Hale turned to Callister, his words delivered not just to one man but as a public verdict, ripping away every mask of arrogance. You've just witnessed a black girl with no credentials and no pedigree crack the code your so-called elite team couldn't. Look at that and ask yourselves what really matters in this world. Callister froze, paling, gripping his file so tightly he couldn't speak. Hatred, shame, and fear warred in his hollow gaze. All the pride built on power, prestige, and degrees had crumbled before the simplest thing he'd once scorned. The resolve and intellect of a black girl cast aside. All around the shop, the Wilcor engineers looked at Sierra with new eyes, filled with admiration, gratitude, and regret. One stepped forward, nodded to Sierra, and quietly but sincerely said, "I'm sorry. We were wrong not to trust your intuition and courage." Behind her, Mr. Maddox stood silent, tears tracing lines down his sun-weathered face. For the first time in decades, he realized his daughter hadn't just won for herself. She'd changed an entire generation's view of true human worth. Sierra remained in the center of the crowd, small but transformed. In her eyes shone pride and calm strength, the look of someone who'd just conquered an unnamed abyss. And out there, beyond these walls, a world that once turned its back on outsiders was beginning to change, sparked by a single moment of courage and intelligence that refused to accept its fate. The applause and murmurs of admiration hadn't even died away before Maddox's auto repairs fell into an uneasy hush. Just as her father's proud smile lingered on his face, Sierra's phone suddenly lit up with an anonymous message. 6 cold words on a black screen. "You shouldn't have done that." Sierra froze. The thrill of victory vanished, replaced by an icy chill crawling up her spine. The bright glow of success in her eyes was eclipsed by the heavy darkness of lurking danger. Everywhere around her, the atmosphere shifted. The Department of Transportation security team instantly triggered an alarm. Sirens blared, red warning lights swept across the walls, and everyone in the shop was ordered back to safety. Director Hale stepped forward, his expression darkening as he recognized a threat more terrifying than any encryption.